This is Reset. I'm Sasha Ann Simons. 2024 is on track to be even hotter than last year, which up until now had been the hottest year on record. But so far, neither presidential candidate has released a comprehensive climate policy plan. We're fresh off the DNC and RNC. So what information did we get about where the candidates and parties stand on climate? And how have the environmental records and policies of the Trump and the Biden-Harris administrations affected us here in the Chicago area? Well, here to break it down is Karen Weigert, director of Loyola University Chicago's Baumhart Center for Social Enterprise and Responsibility, and also Reset's sustainability contributor. Hey, Karen.
Hey, Sasha.
So you were at the DNC Thursday night. This is when we know Vice President Kamala Harris spoke. And as she was describing her vision of freedom, she did have this to say about the environment.
The freedom to breathe clean air and drink clean water and live free from the pollution that fuels the climate crisis.
Yeah, I remember that moment, Karen. I know that probably stuck with you, but what did you make of it?
It was definitely an important moment and interesting, and just to hear her use the word freedom so closely tied to environmental topics and specifically to climate, because this speech was really her opportunity to introduce herself as the Democratic presidential nominee. The eyes of the world were on her. And so it was important to hear those environmental topics, specifically to hear climate, but also to hear the way she's framing it around freedom.
Yeah. Well, what else did you hear about climate on the last day of the DNC?
Well, I think an important factor is that I did hear some things about climate. One of the questions is how much will climate play as we look at this election going forward? And there was some time on Thursday at the DNC. They had a variety of speakers, and one of them was Congressman Maxwell Frost. So he's the first Gen Z member of Congress, and he's from Florida. And he really talked about climate is not just about the future, climate is about right now. And so that was part of that Thursday before we heard the vice president accept the nomination.
I see. So I want to contrast that with what former President Donald Trump said during his acceptance speech at the RNC last month.
I will end the devastating inflation crisis immediately, bring down interest rates, and lower the cost of energy. We will drill, baby, drill.
And so we're clear, Karen, what effect would drilling have?
We have been drilling, I think, is actually one thing to remember. And this is certainly, obviously, a political statement at a political event. And you can hear very different audience engagement from these two different conventions. But the U.S. under Trump certainly was promoting an energy dominance approach, and that's really anchored in fossil fuels. And so opening new lands for drilling, reducing regulations, those were anchored policy. But the U.S. drilling has been exporting, has been at the top of the list in terms of countries producing fossil fuels. So it's certainly a priority of the Trump administration, but it's something that has actually continued in many ways in the current administration.
Mm-hmm. So remind us what drilling for fossil fuels was like under Trump's presidency.
So under Trump's presidency, the U.S. really became the world's largest oil producer, and that was probably about 2018. And that's the spot that the U.S. has sat in ever since. So this is certainly a priority of the Trump team. It certainly is very much in line with the Trump approach. And it's something that is embedded in the economy in many ways. So you see the support from that kind of administration, and you've seen different supports from the current administration. But that trend has actually been one that a lot of people have been watching.
So the Biden-Harris administration has not gone as far in terms of protecting public land from drilling as environmental activists have wanted. Last year, the U.S. actually broke global records for the amount of crude oil that we produced and exported. What should we make of this?
Well, we should always look at the data, and it's important to look at what is happening in different parts of the economy and what is happening with climate. And it speaks to the importance of oil in the national economy today. It speaks to the opportunity that the U.S. has with natural resources right now. And it also sets us up for those questions about what will administrations do to think about the long-term thriving of the country, but also the long-term thriving of the planet. But certainly the Biden administration, I think, has outpaced the Trump administration in improving permits in public lands. So there are a variety of concrete ways you can see trajectories that might not be what the world is anticipating under different administrations.
Yeah.
But that has to be paired with then what do the administrations actively do to change trends? And so it's the change of the trend that we're really looking at.
So let's take a look back at Trump's policies for a moment, Karen. Now, one of his most notable moments was when he took us out of the Paris Climate Accord. What did that symbolize?
That was a hugely symbolic moment. It's particularly symbolic because the Paris Accord was an unprecedented agreement between the nations of the world, specifically to address climate change. And the U.S. had made its own commitment, their NDCs, nationally determined contributions, and it was a voluntary commitment. So the symbolism of taking the U.S. out of the first ever global agreement essentially walks away from a couple of things. One is the importance of addressing climate. The second is it walks away from multilateral agreements. It really speaks to the U.S. acting unilaterally and deprioritizing climate.
Now, Trump appointed 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court, and they've ruled on some very big environmental cases. Sackett versus EPA, for instance, this one forced regulators to roll back protections for wetlands. I want to play a clip from Paul Botts, who's from the Wetlands Initiative, on the importance of wetlands. And when he mentions gray infrastructure, that's where he's talking about things like gutters, sewers, and dams.
The more you have wetlands distributed across your landscape, and I do mean urban as well as rural, I'm not, suburban everywhere. The more you have that, the less you have to rely on gray infrastructure to collect and hold all this massive floodwater, the stormwater. And of course, we have spent the last 150, going almost 200 years doing the opposite. Right, the Midwest in the big scheme of things developed from what's called modern human development, kind of in a blink, just a few human generations, and much of that effort was filling, ditching, removing wetlands. And so now we have learned better, hopefully, and we know, and the climate is sort of enforcing upon us that we need more of these sponges, not fewer.
So how are these rulings impacting our ability to have clean water and clean air, Karen?
We're going to really have to watch the rulings that we see because the Supreme Court is just so different than it was when Trump took office, because he was able to appoint 3 justices and really lock in essentially a supermajority. And it's a majority that has expressed so far some different views about the different roles within government and then the different priorities when you think about environment. So this one, this is a specific case that they heard that really speaks to the Clean Water Act and to limiting the government's oversight over water. So that's the trend I think that we're looking at, which is where is the government involved on these topics of climate, air, water, things that cross our borders, but that surround all of us every day. And in this case, it was a very clear pulling back. As we sit here in the Chicago region, we're in the middle of this conversation because Chicago really was a wetland before we actually paved it over. And so looking at the remnants of wetlands all around this region, that's ultimately very important for the linkage of water systems around us, and then for the connections into streams and lakes and rivers. But it's that connection where the Supreme Court has changed the view of what it grants oversight to. So we will see probably less and less. And this is going to be the question to look at in terms of the government playing a role in some of those regulations that protect clean air and clean water.
Well, this summer, the Supreme Court overturned a decades-old precedent known as the Chevron deference. It says that the court no longer has to defer to regulators like the EPA. Here's a little bit of Chicago law professor Jonathan Macer explaining.
The quality of the water we drink, the quality of the air we breathe, the safety and fuel economy of the cars we drive, all of that is determined not directly by law, but by regulations passed by these agencies. So agency power to make regulations is extraordinarily important to every aspect of daily life.
So what was top of mind for you, Karen, after that ruling?
So this, in many ways, is a big one. It was in place for several decades, but because it looks at this deference in a sense, is it the courts, is it what's written in law, or is there an understanding that different agencies within the federal government have expertise that should be leveraged? The fact that this one is changing that and pulling away from in-house experts to help interpret and deliver policy that's translated in regulation, this is the one that has far-reaching implications. So as we look at what the government can do, we look at how regulations will play forward, when we look at a second potential Trump term or a first Harris term, This changes the role of the courts to give them more ability. It changes the role of the federal government and gives them less ability to deliver their expertise when it's coming through law. It has to really go to what is written in that law. And these are very big, complicated topics, and all the details aren't always in the law. And this changes the balance of who gets to decide what that means.
Trump hasn't outlined a climate or environmental platform, but Project 2025 does. This is the blueprint that many of us have heard about that Trump supporters are hoping would be implemented on day one if he were elected. Now, we should note that Trump has tried to distance himself from this Project 2025, but the policy brief does continue to inform what a second Trump presidency could look like. So we're clear. What does it say about climate, Karen?
Well, one of the things it actually says, and this is actually a factor as we look at this, is it says that folks are preparing for a second Trump term. I think a lot of folks were surprised and less prepared in the Trump world to deliver some of the vision about what could happen on climate. This says that this could be very different if there's a second Trump term. There are hundreds of pages that are being written out about how to deliver an agenda through the federal government. So what might that agenda look like? It's really slashing the climate focus, removing climate goals throughout what the federal agencies do. It's a pull out of the Paris Accord. It is reducing funding, and it's also reducing specific offices like environmental justice at the EPA. So this is a plan that would move back from where the Biden administration has taken the focus and really pull climate out as a priority and essentially remove expertise and dismantle a lot of the work. So it's a whole government unwinding of climate policy, and it's clearly being prepared for.
So overall, how well has the Biden administration, this Biden-Harris administration, how well have they met their climate goals?
If you look at their climate goals, I think it's been a strong term. It's been one term. There's a lot that still needs to happen, but it started with going and recommitting to Paris, but committing in an even higher goal than it had been under the Obama administration. So the goal is now a 50 to 52% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 from a 2005 level. So one is aspiration, but the key thing is delivery. And the major prong here was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes.
That's a 10-year structure that is really providing incentives to build the clean economy as part of the U.S. economy. And what's been quite interesting is the majority of the IRA dollars for major projects are landing in Republican districts. So there's been a lot of action, and we've now seen hundreds of billions of dollars actually going into clean energy projects. That is a different trajectory than we were seeing a couple of years ago. So it's been strong. There's a lot that still needs to happen, but we've seen it from the Inflation Reduction Act through regulations on emissions from vehicles, and even to pollutants like HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, and global focus there. So strong, but we have a lot of emissions coming out of the country and the globe. So leadership is still needed.
Well, tell us this. What will you be paying attention to as this election cycle progresses, Karen?
So it's quick. We're having this conversation and the election is not too far off. What I'll be looking for is more definition from both. It's interesting. Vice President Harris is really only running in the general election. So she doesn't have to define her positions against Democrats. She has to define them against her opponent, President Trump. So more definition. I'll be intrigued to see if there are a lot of visits to places where there are new clean energy and manufacturing jobs, so that link to the economy. And if there's this continued framing around freedom and that fighting climate is patriotic. That'll be a real question for how Vice President Harris positions this in this very quick election.
That's Karen Weigert, Reset's sustainability contributor. Thank you so much for checking in.
Thank you.